In Jerusalem, the words of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu once again set the world on edge. Standing before cameras, his tone was resolute, his message uncompromising. There will never be a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. In the same breath, he vowed to expand Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank, directly challenging the international community at a moment when three powerful Western nations had just recognized Palestinian sovereignty. Netanyahu's warning came as the United Kingdom, Canada and Australia formally announced their recognition of Palestine as a state. The timing could not have been more dramatic. The declarations were not delivered in quiet diplomatic backrooms, but in front of world leaders, journalists, and millions watching across television screens and social media. The symbolism was unmistakable. Long-standing allies of Israel were breaking ranks. For Netanyahu, this was an existential threat, not just to Israel's security, but to his political survival. He framed the recognition as a betrayal, linking it directly to the trauma of the Hamas assault of October 7th, 2023. He told the world that to recognize Palestine after such violence was, in his words, to reward terrorism. His declaration was not simply about borders or treaties. It was a rejection of the very principle of Palestinian statehood. But even as Netanyahu made his vow, voices abroad were striking a profoundly different note. In London, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer stood at a lectern and declared that his government was formally recognising the state of Palestine. It was a speech steeped in symbolism. Britain had recognised Israel more than 75 years ago, carving out a space for the Jewish people after the horrors of the Second World War. Now, decades later, it was extending the same acknowledgement to Palestinians, Starmer said, to revive hope in a two-state solution. His words were deliberate and they carried a weight that went far beyond Britain's borders. For decades, successive British governments had walked carefully around the question of Palestinian recognition, preferring negotiations and balance. Starmer, however, broke that line, joining more than 150 countries that already recognise Palestine. In so doing, Britain became the first G7 country to take this step, a diplomatic earthquake that could not be ignored. Not long after, Canada joined in. Prime Minister Mark Carney, a figure well known on the global economic stage, announced that his country too was recognising Palestine. His message was delivered both in public statements and on social media. Canada, he said, was committed to building a peaceful future for both Palestinians and Israelis. This was not, he emphasised, an abandonment of Israel, but a recognition that Palestinian aspirations could no longer be sidelined. And then came Australia. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese spoke of the legitimate and long-standing aspirations of the Palestinian people. Australia, often aligned with Washington and London in global policy, now moved decisively onto the side of recognition. For Palestinians, it was a moment of validation. For Israel, it was another sign that traditional alliances were fraying. These moves came just as world leaders gathered in New York for the United Nations General Assembly. In the Grand Hall, with flags of nearly 200 nations lining the chamber, the recognition of Palestine dominated the conversation. Palestinian Ambassador Riyad Mansour addressed the assembly with visible emotion, speaking of the decades of suffering, the lives lost, the hopes deferred. His voice broke as he urged nations not to let the chance for justice pass them by. For him and millions of Palestinians, recognition was not simply a political gesture. It was an acknowledgement of dignity, of identity, of belonging to the world of nations. To understand the weight of these announcements, one must look back to 1988, when Palestinian leaders in exile declared the establishment of a state. Nearly three-quarters of United Nations member states have since recognised that declaration. But until now, none of the G7 nations, the world's most powerful democracies and economies, had crossed that line. The United States, Germany, France, Japan and others had long argued that recognition must come only after direct negotiations with Israel. By stepping forward, Britain, Canada and Australia shattered that consensus. For Netanyahu, this was intolerable. He framed it as a dangerous precedent, one that undermined Israel's security and rewarded violence. His government quickly announced plans to accelerate settlement activity, including reopening evacuated outposts in the West Bank. Images circulated of Israeli flags, once lowered, now raised again in defiance. To Netanyahu's critics, this was collective punishment. To his supporters, it was necessary security. At the United Nations, Secretary-General Antonio Guterres warned that unilateral moves on either side could destroy the last remnants of the two-state solution. His plea was measured but urgent. Without negotiations, without compromise, he said, the region risked sliding into perpetual conflict with no political horizon. The global reactions were mixed. In Washington, the United States struck a cautious tone. While reiterating support for a two-state solution, American officials stopped short of recognizing Palestine. The Biden administration, caught between its strategic alliance with Israel and mounting international pressure, urged restraint on all sides. For critics, it was a failure of courage. For supporters, it was a pragmatic attempt to preserve influence over both parties. In Europe, reactions were divided. France, co-hosting a summit with Saudi Arabia on the sidelines of the General Assembly, welcomed the UK's move as a possible opening. President Emmanuel Macron said it was time to give Palestinians tangible political recognition alongside humanitarian aid. Germany, by contrast, was far more cautious, emphasising that recognition should come only through direct negotiations. The split highlighted the tension within Europe itself, between countries ready to act unilaterally and those still bound by older diplomatic caution. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the announcements landed like shockwaves. Palestinian officials welcomed the recognition as a long overdue act of justice. In Ramallah and Gaza, celebrations broke out, with Palestinians waving flags and chanting for freedom. Yet beneath the joy was an unmistakable shadow. Israeli military operations in Gaza continued, settlements expanded in the West Bank, and checkpoints remained in place. Recognition, Palestinians feared, might still be little more than a symbolic victory, if not followed by real political change. Hamas, for its part, claimed the announcements as proof that Israel was increasingly isolated. But many Palestinians were quick to point out that recognition would mean little unless Hamas itself changed course, ending attacks that provided Netanyahu with ammunition for his warnings. For Israel's right-wing coalition, the announcements by Britain, Canada and Australia were seen not as setbacks, but as reasons to tighten control. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and other far-right leaders argued that the recognition proved the world could not be trusted. Their answer was not compromise, but deeper entrenchment. Settlements, they said, must expand. Control over the Jordan Valley must never be relinquished. Jerusalem, they vowed, would remain undivided and eternal. Diplomatic observers noted that these clashing narratives risked creating a paradox. Recognition by Western powers could embolden Palestinians while simultaneously driving Israel further into hardline policies, making the very goal of a two-state solution more elusive. And yet, recognition has power. In international law and diplomacy, it changes the playing field. Once Britain, Canada and Australia took this step, they altered the language of future negotiations. Palestine was no longer only an aspiration, but, in the eyes of these governments, a state. That status carries implications for trade, for aid, for legal disputes and for diplomacy at the United Nations. It also places new pressure on countries like Germany, Japan and the United States, which now find themselves more isolated in refusing recognition. For Netanyahu, the challenge now is twofold: to preserve international support while holding together his fragile domestic coalition. His government faces mounting criticism not just abroad but within Israel itself. Families of hostages taken during the Hamas assault accuse him of prolonging the conflict for political survival. Protesters in Tel Aviv demand accountability. The recognition announcements may strengthen Netanyahu's base on the right, but they also deepen the sense of isolation among moderates. Meanwhile, in Palestinian territories, life remains brutally unchanged. In Gaza, airstrikes continue to reduce neighbourhoods to rubble. Shelters overflow, food is scarce, and medical facilities are overwhelmed. In the West Bank, settlers expand into Palestinian land under army protection, sparking clashes that leave young men dead and families displaced. Recognition does not stop the bulldozers, the checkpoints or the drones, but it does give Palestinians something they have long sought: international validation of their cause. At the General Assembly, applause for recognition echoed through the chamber, but applause does not stop wars. It does not free hostages, nor does it rebuild homes. Yet in the theatre of international politics, gestures matter, and this gesture from London, Ottawa and Canberra may prove to be a turning point. Whether it becomes a milestone on the road to peace or another fracture in a long and bitter conflict will depend on what follows. In the days ahead, all eyes will be on Washington, Berlin, and Paris. Will they follow Britain's lead, or will they hold the line, insisting that only direct negotiations can produce statehood? And what of the Arab world? Will Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt use the moment to push Israel harder, or will they continue cautious diplomacy? For now, one thing is clear. The recognition of Palestine by 3 G7 allies has redrawn the diplomatic map. Netanyahu may declare that a Palestinian state will never exist, but the voices of Britain, Canada, and Australia say otherwise. Between these competing narratives lies the fate of millions, and perhaps the last chance for a two-state solution.